So in this lesson we're going to look at the evolution of the atmosphere, and to do that we're going to divide that into three phases. The first phase starts about 4.5 billion years ago, when we assume that the Earth was first formed, and as you can imagine it was a very hot and hostile place, and initially there wouldn't have been an atmosphere, but gradually through excessive volcanic activity gases were released which formed the initial early atmosphere. Okay, so in this atmosphere you're going to get a very large amount of carbon dioxide released as a result of that activity, and also a considerable amount of nitrogen, and with that over time a lot of water vapor is being released. Okay, so at the moment the water is just in the vapor state because we're dealing with a very hot planet. Now, in addition to those gases, you've also got small amounts of other gases, for example hydrogen sulfide and ammonia and methane being released. Now, with regard to oxygen, well, in the initial atmosphere we can assume that there was very little to no oxygen present in the initial atmosphere. So in this phase we're talking about a billion years, so we're going down to about 3.5 billion years ago where we arrive at phase 2, which is where now the atmosphere in the Earth has cooled a bit, and what that means is that the very large amount of water vapor that was present in the atmosphere starts to condense to form the oceans. So the water vapor there is condensing into the oceans, and that's going to provide the environment necessary for life to come into existence, which we'll talk about later. Okay, now the other important process that's going on in this phase 2 is, as you can see here, the tops have been lopped off of these volcanoes. So what's going on here is we've got a lot of erosion going on due to these really harsh and hostile conditions that are present in phase 1. Just mark that, we've got erosion, and that's going to result in a large amount of calcium ions being deposited into the oceans, and these are going to play an important role in reducing the level of carbon dioxide. So really in our phase 1 we've got an atmosphere with a huge amount of carbon dioxide compared with the other gases, and what we're going to look at now is how in phase 2 and phase 3 the level of that carbon dioxide is going to be reduced, and then look at the processes by which this happens. And so the first process is a purely chemical process. Here, carbon dioxide from the very carbon dioxide rich atmosphere dissolves into the oceans and reacts with the water to form carbonic acid. And carbonic acid is a very weak acid, and so only partially ionizes into two ions. That's the hydrogen ion, that's what you'd expect because it's an acid, and this one is the bicarbonate ion, which is the one that we're interested in here. And so that's what you'd expect, because you can remember that carbon is a non-metal and that non-metal oxides are always acidic. So there we have it. So when carbon dioxide dissolves in the oceans, you're going to get this weak acid formed. Now, what I want you to pay attention to here is we've got this reversible reaction sign. Okay, that means that the reaction can go either to the right or to the left, in the forward direction or in the backwards direction, depending on the conditions, and that's important here. So what happens next is we remember that from this process of erosion, a whole load of calcium ions are deposited into the ocean, and these calcium ions are then going to combine with this bicarbonate ion, okay, there to form calcium carbonate and a hydrogen ion. And this is also, notice, a reversible reaction. Okay, so it can go in both the forward direction or in the backward direction depending on the conditions. Now then, what happens next is calcium carbonate is a solid, so this is precipitated, right? And what will happen is it will form and then sink to the bottom of the ocean. So calcium carbonate starts to get deposited on the ocean bed. All right. Now, what we need to remember is this is a reversible reaction. And if you remember from the unit on reversible reactions that Le Chatelier's principle states that when a particular reversible reaction is in dynamic equilibrium, as is the case here, then any change to the conditions surrounding that reaction will cause the reaction to move in the direction that opposes that change. That's a whole load to get hold of in one sentence, but what that means is this: if the concentration, in this case, of one of the reactants or one of the products is changed in any way, then the reaction will go in the direction that opposes that change. So here the concentration of the calcium carbonate is going to be reduced because it's forming a precipitate and it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. So what will happen is that this reaction will go in the forward direction. The reversible reaction lingo is that the equilibrium position will be shifted towards the right in order to keep the concentration of calcium carbonate the same. Okay, you got that? So repeat, because the calcium carbonate is being precipitated, falls to the bottom of the ocean, its concentration in the upper part of the oceans where this reaction is going on is reduced, and so the forward reaction is favoured here. Well, that means that the concentration of bicarbonate ions will also reduce because the equilibrium position is being shifted towards the right. So that affects the equation above. So if we've got the concentration of bicarbonate ions is reducing here, then this will drive this reaction in the forward direction. And as a result, the levels of carbon dioxide will start to reduce, and consequently more carbon dioxide will dissolve into the oceans. So what we've got here is a type of mechanism which is literally sucking carbon dioxide into the oceans and changing it into calcium carbonate, which is then being deposited on the ocean bed. All right, so we're getting a whole load of calcium carbonate here deposited, and these levels are going to build up. I won't cover the whole ocean floor here, I'll just do it in this part. These levels are going to gradually build up, and then under pressure, the immense pressure that forms as more and more calcium carbonate is deposited on the ocean floor. Okay, so due to the pressure that's building up, this will then be transformed into limestone. Okay, and this type of limestone is called chemical limestone because it originates from a purely chemical process. That's what we've just described here, as opposed to biological limestone, which we're going to look at in a minute, where the process, which is actually very similar in a way to this, but it's going on inside the bodies of shellfish and crustaceans that live in the ocean, and that is a biological process. Okay, we'll look at that in a minute. Now, just to finish off with this phase 2, apart from the chemical processes that are taking place in this phase, we're also beginning to see another process taking place which is also going to be affecting the concentration of the various gases in the atmosphere, and this is a biological process. And this is to do with the introduction of living organisms which are able to photosynthesize. Okay, so starting off with Cyanobacteria, they're going to appear around about 2.7 billion years ago, and then these are going to develop into protozoos, which are single-celled organisms which are also photosynthesizing, and later into multicellular organisms around about 1 billion years ago. Okay, so we've got these cyanobacteria, and so the process that is taking place in these cyanobacteria is photosynthesis, and that's where CO2 dissolves into the oceans. It's consumed by the cyanobacteria, and with the help of light, carbon dioxide and water are synthesized into oxygen and sugars by the living organisms. Okay, we can represent this process with the photosynthesis equation, which you're very familiar with in biology, where we've got carbon dioxide combining with water to produce glucose and oxygen. Now, this process is helped along with a molecule called chlorophyll and a whole load of other complex chemical processes which are involved in achieving this change. That's to say, chemically, without life, this process would be completely impossible. It would never occur. But because life is present now, this reaction is able to take place. So this is going to affect the contents of the atmosphere in two ways. First of all, it causes a lowering in the concentration of carbon dioxide because the microorganisms are absorbing carbon dioxide. And secondly, what we're going to see appearing in the atmosphere is oxygen. So the level of oxygen is going to start increasing very slowly at first because, the amount of photosynthesis going on is not that much at the moment, but gradually as the number of photosynthesizing organisms start to reproduce and increase and evolve into more complex multicellular organisms such as plants, then the level of oxygen will start increasing more and more, and the level of carbon dioxide will start to decrease. We'll have a look at that in the next phase, which is phase 3, where you see the more dramatic effect of photosynthesis on the atmosphere in the last 500 million years. Okay, so we'll look at that in the next unit.